Morning, people. In today's episode of Brexit silently stealing from all of us while we struggle to pay for rent, the Tories actually managed to make Brexit more expensive last year when Liz Truss had a mini budget disaster which crashed the pound to the lowest level since 1985. Because you know the amazing Brexit deal that Boris Johnson negotiated, the one that he spent 3 years telling us that people voted for in 2016, even though it didn't exist in 2016? Well, as part of that deal, the UK agreed to pay about £37 billion as a divorce settlement to the EU. Because when we were in the EU, we worked together with other EU countries on several projects because it was cheaper than doing it ourselves. For example, on scientific research. Put it this way, you and your friends order food at a restaurant, but before the food arrives, you get up and leave. But it's a sharing platter, so they can't just send yours back, and leaving everybody else to pay for your bit would be a dick move. And so we agreed to pay monthly installments to cover the food that we ordered, but obviously the EU works in euros, so the more the value of the pound drops, the more expensive it is to cover that bill. And Brexit already took an axe to the value of the pound on the night of the referendum back in 2016 because everybody lost faith in the UK economy.
But certainly a lot of traders who thought that Remain had a very, very good night are now selling out of sterling as quickly as they can. And the graphs are remarkable, just almost vertically down at the moment, sterling on the markets.
So Brexit made its own divorce bill more expensive from the get-go. But when Liz Truss announced plans to let people who earn over £150,000 a year pay less tax, without saying where she'd make up for the loss in tax revenue, the pound crashed again, which made paying the EU in euros more expensive, and so instead of paying the $719 million a month that we've been paying earlier that year, we paid $764 million. Which creates a really weird symmetry because the mini budget would have gotten rid of the 45p tax bracket, and as a result of that, we had to pay the EU an extra £45 million, and Liz Truss only lasted 45 days as Prime Minister. But don't worry, because according to Jacob Rees-Mogg, we've only got another 45 years to wait until Brexit starts to work. Brexit Britain really is like living in a simulation. Because you've got to put this in context, Brexit began as a promise that we'd save £350 million a week by no longer having to pay for EU membership. Now the real figure is closer to £190 million a week, which isn't far off what we're paying for the Brexit divorce bill, especially when Liz Truss crashed the economy. Now firstly, it's been 7 years since Boris Johnson made that promise, and we're still paying a similar amount. But most importantly, while there were years of debate about whether Boris Johnson's figures of £350 million a week was technically accurate, was it more or less? While we're on that topic, nobody ever talks about the fact that he actually admitted the real figure during the referendum campaign.
Let's be absolutely clear, we cannot minimise this money that we would get back. It is very important. £10 billion is not to be sneezed at.
Which comes out to about £190 million a week, not £350 million, but that's missing the point. Because Brexit was never about how much better or worse it would make life in the UK, but whether it would make life better or worse in the UK. Because he was talking to people who'd just been through 6 years of austerity, of seeing their public services stripped, of seeing their benefits cut. They just needed things to get better. So whether or not people supported Brexit depended on whether they believed it would make things better or worse. And pretty much every economist and expert on the board is saying that Brexit has made things worse, largely by damaging our trade with our 30 closest neighbours. So not only was Boris Johnson's bus a lie in the sense that we're still paying the EU nearly a decade later, but it was a massive con because it acted like paying to be in the EU was simply throwing money down the drain. Like being able to trade easily with our 30 closest neighbours had no effect on the economy, and therefore that every penny that we stopped paying to the EU would mean more money in our pockets. But the reality is it's made the country £100 billion poorer and left the government with £40 billion less to spend on things like the NHS, which is what Jeremy Hunt predicted back when he used to tell the truth about Brexit. So that mini budget made the lie worse because Brexit was sold as a way to help working class people after the financial hardship of austerity and push back against the elites. But Liz Truss's mini budget, which was pushed by the same people who helped sell us Brexit, was done in the name of tax breaks for the rich, which means less money for the NHS and less healthcare for those who can't afford to go private. And because of the effect on the pound, even though it was eventually cancelled, it meant £45 million less for public services. Seriously, when I picture Brexit, I think of Boris Johnson and the Tories driving a bus over our toes, looking back, seeing the damage they've done, and reversing back over our ankles, then driving forward again over our shins, gradually working their way up us while shouting out the window, "You like that, huh? This is what you voted for?" Meanwhile, the rest of the country's just thinking, why has nobody grabbed the wheel from these psychopaths? Have a great week.